Last week, Russia launched an extensive airstrike campaign against ISIS in Syria. This follows the recent formation of an anti-ISIS coalition between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Russia. Statements released from Russia's defense ministry indicate that the campaign has already struck 11 targets, including important training camps and manufacturing plants. However, the U.S. Department of State claims that over 90% of these strikes have not been against ISIS, but have rather been against more moderate rebel opposition groups, some of whom are backed by the U.S. So, what are the true intentions behind these airstrikes, and what does this mean for the Syrian conflict, global politics, and relations between Russia and the U.S.? All this tonight on Politik Focus. Here tonight to talk about the crisis in Syria and the impact of the recent Russian strikes are Politik writers Abigail Lanier and Evan Harari. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, guys.
Thank you for having us.
So I think we're just going to start talking about the crisis in Syria generally. I mean, it's been obviously a very hot topic lately, and so I sort of wanted to get a feel for what you think are the major factors of the crisis right now, whether that be ISIS, the civil war, the Assad regime, etc. So if you would just like to talk about that, that'd be great.
So we all know it started with Assad. Back in 2011, obviously you had some democratic protests. Assad responded in a not so democratic way. And then everyone's grievances come to the forefront. And then also in 2011, Assad releases all the current leaders of ISIS. Much more complicated than that, but I'm drawing a blank right now, so.
So obviously being that it's more than 4 years later since that initial first clash between the protesters and Assad, more factors have definitely come to play. So now I think it's important that we recognize that ideological radicalism has kind of emerged once again as the forefront of the issue, and that original Free Syrian Army has kind of withered away. So I think right now it's important to recognize who are the main competing forces and who is the most viable threat. So
I think when it comes to threats to civilian life, Assad definitely takes the cake. He's killed more civilians than all the other opposition groups combined, and continues to do so this day as a matter of tactic, more than collateral damage. Barrel bombs don't have any purpose other than indiscriminate killing. So in terms of geopolitical threats, obviously Assad, he was there for a while and he didn't all was stable under him, but I don't think there's any remaking Syria into what it once was.
Right.
So in terms, I see Assad as no better than the rest, considering he commands a sliver of the people's allegiance, generally military ties in the Alawite minority, and then he controls a minority of the territory and has very little hope of regaining the south. So
I completely agree that Assad definitely was not a democratic leader. He inherited his position. But that being said, I think that it is important to recognize that you would be creating a power vacuum if you just support the coup and let the Syrian regime, regardless of how oppressive it is, just completely wither, because it is, regardless, it is standing as a viable force right now that can proactively counter ISIS, and I don't think it would be wise to just immediately wipe them out right now at this level of the conflict.
I definitely agree that he needs to be brought to any solution. I personally don't think we should be dedicating a lot of time to just destroying Assad. I think it's more of a containment thing. Because the way I see it right now, Syria is a power vacuum. So especially the south and west. Obviously, ISIS has solidified a hold on power as Assad does in his region, which it's not something we're super happy about. But in terms, borders, we've reached a sort of a stalemate. But I still think I don't necessarily see Assad as a solution, just because I don't see him regaining all that power. But I definitely agree that we don't want to just kill everybody and then just see what happens next.
Right. Well, you bring up ISIS, and so that's really the next thing I was going to ask. Turning to that, so how exactly would you describe ISIS's rise to power? And then furthermore, what level of a threat do they pose to the region and the region's stability? And then finally, why have they been so hard to eliminate and to take down? Why have they continued to increase in power?
Sure. I don't know everything about the development of ISIS. I apologize, I'm not an expert. But it originally started as kind of a quasi-Al-Qaeda affiliate that was going to kind of take a prominent role, I believe, in more of the Syrian region. No.
Iraq.
Was that correct, or is that in Iraq?
Yeah.
Regardless, but they decided they weren't going to pledge their allegiance to Al-Qaeda and Zawahiri, And from there, they decided that they were going to attack more of the local rivals rather than just promote. We actually learned about this in class about doing major terrorist attacks on like big targets like America or somewhere in Europe. That would be more symbolic in nature. They were more about attacking their own apostates within the region. And so, because Al Qaeda obviously vastly differs in that ideological view, that's kind of where ISIS emerged from. Is just that belief.
Yeah, I also think it's important to acknowledge just sort of how they came to be to protect Sunni Muslims in Iraq. So following the Iraq War, you have a real power vacuum for a long period, and you have a very empowered Shiite majority there. Majority, right? I hope so. Anyway, so you have a very empowered Shiite faction, obviously, and as tends to happen when pretty much like civil life is destroyed, people turn to religious affiliation to sort of like just retrench their community, and then there turned out to be a lot of sectarian violence between them. And there wasn't a lot of support for the Sunni community because most of our allies were Shiite. So the Islamic State sort of emerges on this territorial basis because it's protecting communities at first. And this is, I think, part of the reason why it's so hard is because it provides relative stability for a lot of these communities.
Yeah.
And like these people who have been living like through war and like famine and like all these terrible, terrible things. Obviously, we hear about the ISIS atrocities, and I'm not saying like ISIS is good, but they provide for certain areas. They provide like it's what you either like starve and like or whatever.
Provide social services.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is true they have stabilized certain Sunni regions, but
yeah.
I mean, how many articles have we read in the New York Times, BBC, whatnot, hearing all these refugees now who have made it to Europe and are starting to tell their stories, and you hear that yes, you know, they would originally, like the Sunnis would accept this rule just to get that security. But when they had the Shia law firmly implanted and like forced upon them, they just realized that it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. So I think it's important that I think ISIS, as of late, as they establish themselves more in these communities, I think they'll definitely have more uprisings on their hands and face more backlash. Even though right now it's in a state of fear on the population's part, which is why we're seeing it be kind of.
Right. I think it's important. So I think ISIS is a huge threat to regional stability and not a viable state going forward. But I think it's important to recognize that the allegiance they do command a lot of people, and the way people a lot of see ISIS, like a lot of their rules are more of a nuisance than like a mortal threat that we see them. Right. I saw a Vice News documentary about it, and like people, when it comes to the people things complain about, it's not like we hear about like the rape of Yazidis, like God forbid, it's terrible stuff, but like Assad's troops have done the same thing. And it's less on sectarian grounds, and it doesn't have that tag, but it's just, or maybe it is on sectarian grounds because he has that Alawite affiliation. But it's just not as well publicized. And when it comes to people's opposition to ISIS, it's like it's a lot of religious regulations, and it's more sort of mundane stuff.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to turn. So we've discussed the Assad regime, and we've talked about ISIS. So now I kind of want to turn to Russia's recent attacks on ISIS targets. Right. So I think. It's really important to talk about what we think the true motives behind Russia's attack on the ISIS targets are, because as we know, as the U.S. Department of State has reported, a lot of these targets were actually more moderate rebel groups, not necessarily ISIS. So what do you think Russia's real intentions are, and do you think that they could be successful in bringing down ISIS?
Sure. Well, I actually just recently wrote an article in the Politik about this, which Evan so gratefully edited. Thank you again for it. But the claims that I actually make are that Russia's main motives are, number one, to form an international coalition, to lead this coalition that is able to effectively counter ISIS. Because in Russia's view, the American-led coalition has not mustered any type of effective counter to ISIS. Not many gains have been made. There hasn't been much success on any front. So that's number one. And two, despite all of Assad's misgivings, which Russia has recognized to a certain extent, Russia, Putin both believe that Syria and Assad, they are the legitimate authorities. And if you remove Assad and his regime, then you are essentially creating this power vacuum that I mentioned before, and it will only further destabilize the region. You'll give in to mob rule, and if there's anything that Russia fears, it is mob rule. So basically that's what Russia is trying to do, legitimize the sovereign authority, which it sees in Assad, and the international coalition.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think Assad is sort of their longtime buddy in the region, and you have to remember that Russia's very close to this, and Russia also has a historic issue with Islamic militias in the Chechnya, and which is like ironic little, not ironic, just a little side effect of Russia's involvement is that a lot of militants are coming from Chechnya to fight for ISIS.
And what 4,000 now?
Yeah, I have no idea. But it's a lot. Yeah.
More than Americans, anyway.
Yeah.
That are going.
I definitely agree that America's strategy thus far has been basically ineffective, and you see Iraq turning to Russia for that very reason. But I think a lot of Russia's motivations are more internal. I think Putin, me personally, I think Putin built his reputation a lot on his success in like fighting Russia's 9/11, blah blah blah. So it's sort of, and also like flagging economy at home, and not really any prospects for improvement. So this is sort of a way of rallying around the flag for him.
Right.
That's definitely not a strategy unique to Russia, but I think it's definitely effective.
So we've talked about Russian strategy. So do you think then that this is a viable strategy, or do you think that it has the possibility of further destabilizing the region and increasing violence?
I mean, I think it's viable just in terms of how extensive it is. I mean, you have troops on the ground. You have, massive air campaign. There are no troops on the ground?
There are advisors, but there aren't any active Russian troops.
But that's more than what we've done.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think just in terms of how intense it is, and I think Russia, like I said, Russia is actually geographically close to this, and unlike us, they don't have many other niches to fall back on. You know what I mean? Like American public isn't all that concerned with Syria. Like it's like number 6 on our like concerns list behind like jobs and like whatever, and like abortion and all this other stuff. Like we're barely talking about this in debates. Whereas in Russia, like it's right there. So like they're probably gonna put a lot more into it than we are.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's one of the main problems with the American initiative in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, if you really want to talk about it. How are we invested? How is the American people invested in any of those conflicts? If you don't have the American public to rally behind your cause, then you just see a general lacking in overall motivations, and that leads directly to how effective you are. So whereas Russia, who does have slightly Islamophobic tendencies, despite Putin saying that obviously he respects the beauty and peacefulness of the Islamic religion, they are concerned, having suffered many terrorist attacks, the Chechen wars, etc. So I think we need, as Americans, we need to recognize that there are other powers in the world who have more direct interests in this conflict, and we, instead of condemning their actions, we should somehow try to cooperate with them.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So do you think that Russia and the United States will come to a head in Syria and will sort of end up battling out kind of a proxy war, or do you think that there is a possibility for cooperation between the two nations?
I mean, I think it's not just Russia and the United States in this case. It's like the United States and NATO versus Russia and sort of a shaky alliance. And Russia and Assad, and then I don't even know how Iran factors into this, to be honest. But probably Iran somehow.
Yeah.
So I think just because of like the weight of countries that we bring to bear, there's a possibility of some cooperation, because like Putin's not suicidal. So I think if we actually force some kind of confrontation, like there's not going to be a nuclear war. Me personally, I don't think that, or I hope not.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that there's going to be a nuclear war. I think we both have sane, rational leaders in power, despite some critics of Putin, that's for sure. But I think that it is actually more the United States that could come into conflict with Russia. I wouldn't put too much weight in NATO, because I just think that that's a puppet, to be honest with you, of the United States, to do with it as it will. And my major concern is that Russia, which has, said that it wants to form this coalition, that is willing to cooperate with others, that wants to compromise, come to the table, negotiate, talk about deconfliction, which I didn't even think was a word, to be honest, before Carrie mentioned it. But then you immediately see that the American government officials and media responses to some of their actions have been aggressive, have been condemning. They attack the Russian people, and we've seen this time and time again, especially throughout the Cold War. And what that does is essentially puts Russia immediately on the defensive. They assume that they're being victimized once again, and that's why they are perceived as being more aggressive. So it's just a back and forth cycle that needs to end.
Right.
To say.
Right, of course. But at the same time, I would add to that and get your thoughts on a lot of the criticism from the American government right now has been that Russia has not really been straightforward about its actions in the region. So a lot of the weapons that they've supplied recently to the area and the advisors that they have on the ground, they've sort of been misleading about. And then similar with the targets, they said they hit ISIS targets, but they were oftentimes more moderate rebels, some of whom were backed by the U.S. So, I mean, wouldn't you say that also plays a role in the conflict?
I mean, I think the main thing for Russia is they have to back off Assad as their main ally in the region. Like, my personal viewpoint is that Assad is not a legitimate force going forward. I think he lost his legitimacy once he killed, however many of his own people. And I think just strategically, I mentioned this a few times before, I just don't think he has a hope of regaining most of the territory and being a viable, stabilizing force in the region. Right. So I think for Russia to come to the table, they need to acknowledge that, Assad, it maybe not go away right away.
Right.
Maybe we don't obviously strike him back, blah, blah, blah. But we need to involve him in a process that involves setting up a new government. Mm-hmm. And I'm personally optimistic for this because obviously America doesn't have a great track record with establishing new governments. But just with like I said before, with how many nations actually have interest in the region, I think there's a possibility that we can actually sustain the interest and resources to actually get a new functioning government.
Right.
But I think Assad cannot be a part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you want to, I was going to ask about the no-fly zone. I think you said earlier you could speak to that. So recently a lot of politicians have come out in support of the no-fly zone, or just within the last week. So do you think, we've talked about potential conflict between Russia and the United States, but could you explain maybe the rationale for backing the no-fly zone, and why you think that despite the potential conflict it could cause, some politicians still support it?
I actually don't see how the no-fly zone could actually do anything at this point. Just the region that Secretary Kerry was talking about, it doesn't cover the western coast of Syria, which is where the Russians are based at Latakia and Tartus. So it wouldn't be going there. It's more along the northern border with Turkey, and Russia has already demonstrated that it is willing to invade Turkey's airspace to conduct its own operations. And I don't think it's very fair of the United States to try to impose a no-fly zone, only because we've seen Americans do the same thing, invading, Iraqi, sometimes Pakistani airspaces without the approval of, or the knowledge even of the respective governments. So being with how easily they're able to be broken, I just don't think that it would be a reasonable or effective strategy.
Okay.
I mean, I think one of the reasons it's so politically popular just because it's a good buzzword.
Yeah.
That's a good easy answer.
It's I do think it's possible. I was surprised. I didn't know that it was in the northern region. I thought we were talking about more of a southern region, just for sort of humanitarian reasons, because so many at least a couple weeks ago, that's what people were talking about because of all these barrel bombs being dropped in the south and killing civilians, blah blah blah. Going forward in the north, I think it's more of a nod to Turkish worries about its own security. But to be honest, I have not insufficient knowledge of that.
It's mostly over the Kurdish region, which has already been established by, has been taken by the Kurds and has been protected and defended relatively well, compared to some of the other territories in the region. So I just don't see the validity of it.
Well, Turkey has its own concerns over the Kurds.
Really?
That sounds like another debate.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for all of your insight. I think you've added a lot to the discussion, and we really appreciate you guys being here. So
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Yeah,
you
it's
very
great.
much. Yeah.
Thanks. All right. I'm Piper Jano, and that's it for tonight on Politik Focus. Thanks. Good night.